In this video, Jordan Peterson explains what thinking really is.
There are neuropsychological tests, and the neuropsychologists like to think that IQ is something that's primitive and that they've already, advanced past. And so they have specific prefrontal tests, say, that hypothetically assess specific prefrontal abilities. And then they'll note that if you take a single test of prefrontal ability and correlate it with IQ, it'll only correlate at about 0.3 or 0.4. And then they'll assume, because it only correlates that low, that it's measuring something other than what IQ is measuring. But really what happens is that it's just not a very good IQ test, and the reason that the correlation is so low is because of measurement error. So if you gave the same test to the same person 20 times, and then you varied the test so there were 30 variants of it, and you gave those all to the same person 20 times, then what would come out would be a score that would be much more highly correlated with IQ and probably indistinguishable from it. And so you'll learn from neuropsychologists that there's such a thing as prefrontal ability, and that's associated with executive control, and that's associated with self-regulation, which would be control over your impulses. And as far as I can tell, that's all completely wrong. And it took me like 10 years to figure that out, because I was taught that it was right, and it wasn't until I plowed through it painfully and understood that there was no evidence for that. So I can tell you how that works. So for example, we gave a neuropsych battery that consisted of dorsolateral prefrontal tests to 3,000 people. It was a 90-minute battery, so it was exhaustive. And when we factor analyzed it, when there was only about 200 participants, we got 4 factors. But then when we factor analyzed it after we had 3,000 participants, we got 2 factors. And one was one on which almost all the tests loaded, and it was undoubtedly fluid intelligence. So, but it's worse than that, you know, because you hear about how the prefrontal cortex regulates behavior. Well, here's a problem with that. What's the correlation between IQ and conscientiousness? 0, roughly speaking. It's probably a little off 0, although it might not be. And you know that because the dimensions of the big 5 are roughly orthogonal. I showed you at the beginning of this that each trait of the big 5 traits is correlated with the other trait on an average of about 0.2. Now, why that is, it's probably because of something like, what would you call? It's probably a halo effect. If you tend to rate yourself as positive on one trait, more conscientious, more agreeable, more emotionally stable, you're going to tend to rate yourself as more positive on the other traits. So that would artificially inflate their correlation. That's one way of looking at it. Anyways, weirdly enough, the correlation between conscientiousness and IQ is essentially 0. Now that's a big problem, isn't it? Because it's unconscientious people that seem to be behaviorally dysregulated, right? They can't stick to a task, they jump about, they're not on track, they appear impulsive, although we don't know how to define impulsive, by the way, but your Hill psychologists use that all the time. It's like, well, if prefrontal ability regulates behavior, how come the correlation between intelligence and other forms of executive control are correlated with conscientiousness at 0, right? 0 is a very bad number when you're testing out a hypothesis. So, and you know, if you think about it, it has to be that way, and the reason it has to be that way is this. Like, so if you're dreaming, you're going to just lay there and dream, eh? But your eyes are going to move back and forth. Now you might say, why aren't you running around acting out your dreams while you're dreaming? And the answer to that is there's a little switch in your head, roughly speaking, that shuts off your motor apparatus when you're dreaming. And so what happens is you can't run around and act out all your dreams because you're paralyzed. And sometimes people wake up in that state. It's called sleep paralysis. They wake up, they're sort of half awake, and they can't move. And then they often hallucinate all sorts of weird things and think aliens have come and abducted them and various peculiarities. But if you take a cat and you take out that little switch, then the cat will run around while it's dreaming until it runs into something, which is the problem with running around acting out your dreams. So, what does that allow one to conclude? Well, if you couldn't abstract away from your behavior, you couldn't think, right? Because what thinking means is to represent an alternative world, or maybe just a tiny little fraction of the world, whatever, to represent it abstractly, to manipulate it around, but not to simultaneously act it out. Then it wouldn't be abstracting at all. It would be fiddling about with the world through trial and error. So you have to be able to pull what you think about out of your body, so to speak, play with it, and then implement it back in. Now it looks maybe like the ability to implement a plan is associated with conscientiousness, but we don't understand that. That would be industriousness. And we don't know a bloody thing about industriousness. Like, it's just a black hole. But the idea that it's your ability to think that allows you to regulate your behavior strikes, well, there's no evidence for it. There's no evidence for it. Smart people are not necessarily better at regulating their behavior. So, because you can have a very unconscientious smart person, and I see them in my clinical practice now and then, they come and say, well, I'm really smart, and here's the evidence, but I'm doing very badly in everything. They're underachievers, roughly speaking. You know, so they can't implement their thoughts, not in any stable manner. So the fact that they're smart, you know, on average across their life, smart people are healthier mentally and physically than people who aren't as smart. But the reason for that isn't because their intelligence allows them to regulate their health. The reason for that is because their intelligence allows them, roughly speaking, to succeed, so they're higher up in the dominance hierarchy. And if you're higher up in the dominance hierarchy, then your life isn't as stressful and you don't get sick as often. But that doesn't indicate that there's a direct control between your intelligence and your behavioral output. There's very little evidence for that. Well, I think there's no evidence for it. So that's rather shocking. So, you know, to me, that just wiped out a whole substrata of psychological theorizing, and it's, I'm sure, how many of you have come up against the proposition that prefrontal ability was associated with behavioral control? Yeah. Well, it isn't. So, you know, not any more than first of all, it's not differentiable from IQ, regardless of what the neuropsychologists say, because they don't know anything about psychometrics generally, and they don't like IQ, because if they studied IQ, then what they'd find is all the things that they're studying are basically variants of IQ, and that would suck, because other people have already figured out IQ. And then there's the big problem, which is, well, variation in prefrontal ability, which is equivalent to variation in IQ, isn't correlated with behavioral control. It's a really big problem. So I would like to say, well, what is correlated with behavioral control? But the problem with that is, well, I don't know what you mean by behavioral control. I don't know how you're going to measure it. And if you do measure it, the probability that you're going to come up with something like conscientiousness is pretty much 100%. So, all right.